The porcelain shattered against the imported Italian marble floor. But it was not a plate, it was my heart. Or at least, the physical manifestation of a legacy that had survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the turbulent rise of my family's shipping empire. My daughter-in-law, Serena, stood over the fragments of the 1924 Patek Philippe pocket watch, a look of utter disdain painted across her perfectly contoured face. She wiped her hands on a napkin as if she had just touched something filthy. Beside her, her mother Linda let out a cackle that sounded like glass grinding in a garbage disposal. It was Christmas Eve. The air in my Seattle mansion should have smelled of pine needles and roasted duck. Instead, it reeked of betrayal. I sat at the head of the mahogany table, 22 guests freezing in suspended animation, their silverware hovering halfway to their mouths. I looked at my son, Julian. He was staring at the tablecloth, his jaw tight, his eyes refusing to meet mine. He said nothing. He did nothing. In that deafening silence, which stretched for 42 agonizing seconds, the mother in me finally died so that the businesswoman could resurrect. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply reached into my velvet clutch, pulled out my phone, and initiated the sequence of events that would burn their parasitic world to the ground. But to understand why the destruction of a watch was the final straw, you have to understand the woman who held the match. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am 62 years old. I did not inherit a dynasty. I built one from rust, salt water, and the sheer refusal to be ignored. My story began far from the crystal chandeliers and silk drapes of my current life. I grew up in the gray, industrial docklands of Bremerton, Washington. My father, Arthur, was a foreman at the shipyards. He was a man of calloused hands and few words, who smelled permanently of diesel and rain. He taught me that respect wasn't something you demanded loudly, it was something you commanded quietly through competence. When he passed away from lung complications due to asbestos exposure, he left me nothing but a small life insurance policy and that pocket watch. It had belonged to his father, a man who laid railroad tracks across the Pacific Northwest. The watch was not just a timepiece, it was a compass. Engraved on the back were the words, "Integrity is the currency of the soul." I took that currency and invested it. I started Vance Logistics with one rusted trawler and a loan that had an interest rate bordering on criminal. I was 22, a woman in an industry dominated by men who thought the only place for a female on a dock was bringing them coffee. I learned to shout over the roar of crane engines. I learned to negotiate contracts while standing in ankle-deep mud. I married a man named Robert, a gentle soul who was an architect, the softness to my hardness. We built a life. We built a fortune, but our greatest project was our son, Julian. Robert died in a car accident when Julian was 15. The loss turned my heart into a stone fortress. I poured all my unspent love, all my grief, and all my resources into Julian. He was a sensitive boy, artistic like his father, but with a passivity that worried me. I shielded him from the harsh realities of the business. I wanted him to have the softness I had to sacrifice. I sent him to the best boarding schools, paid for Ivy League tuition, and handed him a seat on the board of directors before he had even earned his first paycheck. I thought I was protecting him. In reality, I was crippling him. Then came Serena. They met at a gallery opening in downtown Seattle 4 years ago. Julian was 24. Serena was 26. She was breathtaking, I will give her that. She had the kind of beauty that felt engineered hair that fell in perfect obsidian waves, eyes that were a piercing, icy blue, and a smile that could light up a room while simultaneously assessing the net worth of everyone in it. She introduced herself as a lifestyle curator and brand ambassador. I later learned that meant she was unemployed with an Instagram account. From the moment she shook my hand, her grip limp, and her eyes scanning over my shoulder to see if there was anyone more important in the room, I knew. A mother's intuition is a primal, terrifying thing. It bypasses logic and strikes directly at the gut. I saw a predator. Julian saw a muse. The courtship was a whirlwind of performative romance. Serena documented every date, every gift, every bouquet of roses on her social media channels. Julian was not a partner. He was a prop in the movie of her life. She moved into our penthouse 3 months later. That was when the subtle erosion of my life began. It started with small comments. "Eleanor, darling, this furniture is a bit dated, isn't it? Very early 2000s. Then it was the isolation. "Oh, Julian, let's just stay in tonight. Your mother looks tired. We shouldn't bother her." Slowly, she built a wall between my son and me, brick by brick, mortared with fake concern and manipulative affection. When they announced their engagement, I offered to pay for the wedding. I expected a budget of perhaps $50,000 or $60,000. Serena presented me with a binder the size of an encyclopedia. The venue was a vineyard in Napa Valley. She wanted a custom gown from Paris, a 10-piece orchestra, and gift bags for guests that cost more than my father's annual salary in 1960. The total came to nearly $1 million. I sat Julian down in my study, the heavy oak desk between us feeling like a barricade. "Son," I said, tapping the spreadsheet, "this is excessive. You are just starting out. This money could be a down payment on a house, an investment portfolio." Julian looked uncomfortable, shifting in his leather chair. "Mom, please. It's Serena's dream. She has a certain image to maintain. Her followers expect a certain level of excellence." "Her followers are not paying the bill," I replied dryly. "I am." "You can afford it," he snapped, a flash of entitlement crossing his face that I had never seen before. "Why are you being so controlling? Do you want to embarrass me?" That was the lever Serena had installed in his mind, that my financial prudence was actually malice. I relented. I paid for the wedding. I smiled for the cameras. I watched my son pledge his life to a woman who spent the entire ceremony checking her reflection in her phone screen. After the honeymoon in the Maldives, also paid for by me, they claimed the housing market was too volatile to buy. "We'll stay at the mansion just for a few months," Serena chirped. "It'll be so nice to have family time." Those few months turned into 3 years. My home, a sanctuary of quiet elegance, was transformed into a content creation studio. Ring lights appeared in the living room. My antique rugs were rolled up because they clashed with the aesthetic. Packages arrived daily: designer clothes, high-end electronics, obscure skincare devices. The recycling bin was always overflowing with cardboard boxes from Net-a-Porter and Saks Fifth Avenue. And then came Linda. Serena's mother arrived from Florida with 4 suitcases and a sob story about a flooded condo. "Just for a week or 2, Serena promised. Linda was a faded copy of her daughter, loud, brassy, and possessing an endless appetite for white wine and unsolicited advice. She treated my house staff like her personal servants. She complained about the thread count of the sheets in the guest suite. She critiqued my chef's cooking, calling the coq au vin too earthy. I retreated. I spent more time at the office, burying myself in logistics reports and shipping manifestos to avoid the toxicity in my own home. I was the CEO of a multinational corporation, yet I felt like a ghost haunting my own hallways. The turning point came in early November of this year. I was reviewing the quarterly personal expense reports with my longtime accountant, Marcus. Marcus has been with me since the days of the single trawler. He is a man who treats decimal points with religious reverence. "Eleanor," Marcus said, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose, "we need to talk about the supplementary accounts." I frowned. "The ones for Julian? For household expenses?" "The spending has accelerated," Marcus said grimly. He slid a thick dossier across the desk. "In the last fiscal year alone, the outflow is nearly $2.3 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. Impossible. The house upkeep is barely a fraction of that." "It's not the house," Marcus said softly. "It's the lifestyle. A Porsche Cayenne leased under the company name, but driven solely by Serena. A rental apartment in downtown Seattle that is currently occupied by a friend of Linda's. First-class flights to Milan, Paris, and Tokyo for brand research. And the jewelry, Eleanor, the jewelry bills alone are over $400,000. I flipped through the pages. My hands did not shake. My blood ran cold. There were charges for consulting fees paid to a shell company registered to Linda Thorne. There were withdrawals for cash at casinos in Las Vegas. It was a hemorrhage. Cut them off, I said, my voice flat. If we do that abruptly without cause, Julian might challenge it legally if his name is on the trust, Marcus warned. We need a strategy. I don't need a legal strategy, I whispered, closing the file. I need to know who my son really is. That evening, I returned home early. The rain was battering the windows of the mansion. As I walked past the library, the door was slightly ajar. I heard voices. She's looking frail, don't you think? It was Serena's voice, sharp and devoid of the sugary coating she used in my presence. She's an ox, Linda scoffed. That woman will live to be 100 just to spite us. She can't live forever, Serena laughed. I checked the trust documents Julian left on the desk. If she becomes incapacitated, senile or mentally unfit, Julian gets power of attorney. And since Julian does whatever I tell him, we get the keys to the kingdom, Linda finished, the clink of a wine glass punctuating the sentence. I just need to push her a bit, Serena continued. Make her snap, she's already stressed. A few more months of pressure, maybe a public outburst, and we can make a case for dementia. Then we put her in one of those nice facilities in Switzerland, and we finally renovate this mausoleum. I stood in the hallway, the shadows concealing me. A cold, deadly clarity washed over me. They weren't just mooching off me. They were plotting my demise. They were planning to bury me alive to get to the gold. I walked away silently. I went to my room and opened the safe. I took out the Patek Philippe watch. I held it to my chest, feeling the cold metal warm against my skin. I thought of my father in the shipyard rain. I thought of the integrity he valued so much. And I decided that if they wanted a show, I would give them a finale they would never forget. I spent the next month planning. I hired a private investigator to document every movement Serena and Linda made. I had forensic accountants trace every cent of the stolen money. I updated my will. I prepared the transfer of assets. And I organized the Christmas dinner. I spared no expense. I hired the best caterers in Seattle. I decorated the house with white roses and silver ribbons. I invited our closest family friends, business associates, and even a few of Serena's influencer friends she was so desperate to impress. The dinner began well enough. The wine flowed. The turkey was perfect. Serena was in her element, posing for photos, broadcasting her perfect life to her 300,000 followers. She wore a dress that cost $8,000 my money and the diamond earrings I had seen on the credit card statement. Julian sat beside her, looking tired, a shadow of the bright young man he used to be. When it was time for gifts, Serena made a production of it. She gave me a box of anti-aging creams, because at your age, Eleanor, maintenance is everything, she said with a sweet, venomous smile. The table chuckled uncomfortably. I smiled back. Thank you, dear, thoughtful as always. Then, I reached under the table and produced the small, hand-carved wooden box. The room went quiet. Julian, I said, my voice steady. This year, I wanted to give you something that isn't bought in a store, something that cannot be put on a credit card. Julian took the box. He opened it. His eyes widened as he saw his grandfather's watch resting on the silk lining. This belonged to your grandfather Arthur, I told the table, though my eyes were locked on my son. He worked in the shipyards for 40 years. He didn't have a Porsche. He didn't have a penthouse. He had honor. He used to tell me that a man's character is defined by what he does when no one is watching. I am giving this to you now, Julian, because I believe you are at a crossroads. I want this watch to remind you of who you come from. Julian touched the glass face of the watch, tears forming in his eyes. Mom, I know how much this means to you. Thank you. Before he could close the box, Serena snatched it from his hands. Let me see, she demanded. She turned the watch over, her nails clicking against the metal. She frowned. It's old. Look, the casing is scratched. And it's not even gold, is it? It's brass. It's gold-plated, I said quietly. But the value is not in the metal. Well, it looks like junk, Serena laughed, holding it up for her friends to see. Seriously, Eleanor? You run a billion-dollar logistics company, And you give your only son a piece of pawnshop trash for Christmas? That is so tacky. Serena, stop, Julian muttered, reaching for it. No, honestly, it's insulting, she continued, her voice rising, performing for her audience. It smells like old metal and grease. Ugh. And then, with a look of pure malice, she opened her fingers. The watch fell. Time seemed to slow down. I watched the heirloom spinning in the air. I watched Julian's hand twitch but fail to move. I heard the impact, the sickening crunch of the crystal face shattering against the marble. The back casing popped open. The gears spilled out like guts. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Linda started laughing. Oh, oops, Butterfingers. Well, at least now you can buy him a Rolex, Eleanor. Something real. I looked at the broken watch. Then I looked at Julian. I waited. 1 second, 5 seconds, 10. Julian? I said softly. Are you going to pick it up? He looked at Serena, who was smirking. He looked at me. He looked at the floor. His face flushed red. But he didn't move. He was paralyzed by his own weakness. That was the moment. The 40-second mark. The moment I realized my son was not a victim. He was an accomplice. I stood up. I didn't yell. I smoothed the front of my silk dress. I walked over to the mess on the floor, knelt down, and gathered the pieces of my father's legacy into my handkerchief. I placed them in my pocket. I pulled out my phone. Eleanor, sit down. You're making a scene, Serena hissed. I ignored her. I dialed the first number on speed dial. Mr. Henderson, I said into the phone, my voice amplifying in the silent room. Yes, I know it's Christmas Eve. Initiate Protocol 0 immediately. Yes. The Porsche Cayenne, license plate Vance 1. It's in the driveway. Repossess it. Now? Serena's smile faltered. What? I dialed the second number. Security? This is Eleanor Vance. I want the biometric access codes for the estate changed. Effective immediately. Remove all authorized users except myself. Yes, including Julian. Julian stood up, panic finally reaching his eyes. Mom, what are you doing? I didn't look at him. I dialed the third number. Credit services? This is Eleanor Vance. I am reporting 4 cards as stolen. No, not stolen by a stranger. Stolen by unauthorized users. Cancel the platinum, the black, and the corporate expense accounts. Freeze the joint checking assets. Yes, total freeze. You can't do that, Linda shrieked, jumping up. We have reservations for Aspen next week. I finally looked at them. My gaze was colder than the Seattle rain. You have nothing, I said. You are guests in my house who have overstayed their welcome by 3 years. I walked over to the side table, where I had placed a manila envelope earlier that evening. I tossed it onto the turkey platter. It landed with a heavy thud. What is this? Serena asked, her voice trembling. That, I said, is a forensic accounting of every dollar you have siphoned from this family. $2.3 million. Fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse. My lawyer, who is sitting right there at the end of the table, has already drafted the civil suit and the eviction notice. The room turned to look at Mr. Sterling, my attorney, who raised his glass of wine in a silent toast. Eviction? Julian stammered. Mom, we live here. Not anymore, I said. You have exactly 1 hour to pack your personal belongings. Not the things I bought, just the things you paid for. Which, by my calculation, is practically nothing. You're bluffing, Serena sneered, though her face was pale. You wouldn't kick your own son out on Christmas. My son died the moment he watched his wife destroy his grandfather's memory and said nothing, I replied. The man standing in front of me is a stranger, and strangers don't sleep in my house. The sound of a heavy engine rumbling outside broke the tension. The orange flashing lights of a tow truck washed over the dining room walls. My car! Serena screamed, running to the window. My car, I corrected. The next hour was a blur of chaos. Serena was screaming, throwing vases, calling me a witch, a hag, a monster. Linda was stuffing silverware into her purse until my security team escorted her out. Julian just stood there, shell-shocked, watching his life dismantle. When they finally stood on the porch, surrounded by a few hastily packed suitcases, the rain was pouring down in sheets. Serena was shivering in her thin dress. She tried to order an Uber, but her card was declined. She tried another, declined. She looked at me, mascara running down her face. "Where are we supposed to go?" "I hear the Motel 6 on the highway has vacancies," I said. "It's very affordable." I closed the heavy oak door in their faces. I locked it. And then, for the first time in 3 years, I sat in my living room and listened to the sound of peace. The fallout was swift and brutal. The next day, Serena's social media empire collapsed. It turns out, it's hard to be a lifestyle influencer when you're posting from a dingy motel room. I didn't even have to leak the story. One of the guests at the dinner had recorded the entire confrontation and posted it. The video was titled, "Gold Digger Gets Owned by CEO Mom." It had 4 million views by Boxing Day. The comments were merciless. Brands dropped Serena faster than she had dropped the watch. Her friends blocked her number. Linda, realizing the gravy train had derailed, took a bus back to Florida 2 days later, leaving her daughter behind with nothing. And Julian? Julian tried to call me for 2 weeks. I didn't answer. He showed up at the office. Security turned him away. He needed to hit rock bottom. He needed to understand that the cushion he had rested on his entire life was gone. I kept tabs on him, of course. I'm a mother, not a monster. I knew they moved into a small studio apartment in a rough part of town. I knew Serena got a job as a hostess at a chain restaurant because no high-end boutique would hire her. I knew Julian was working construction, day labor, hauling drywall and mixing cement. February came, then March. One rainy Tuesday in April, my secretary buzzed me. "Mrs. Vance, there is a young man here to see you. He says he doesn't need to come up, he just wants to leave something." "Send him up," I said. Julian walked into my office. He looked different. He was thinner. His skin was tanned and weathered. His hands were covered in small cuts and calluses. He wore work boots and a flannel shirt. He didn't look like the Prince of Vance Logistics. He looked like Arthur. He didn't sit down. He stood awkwardly by the door. "I'm not here to ask for money," he said, his voice raspy. "And I'm not here to ask for my job back." "Why are you here?" I asked, keeping my face neutral. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. He walked to my desk and placed it gently on the glass. "I took it to a specialist," he said. "It took me 4 months to save up the money for the restoration. I worked double shifts at the site. I ate ramen noodles every night, but I paid for it. Me, not you, not the trust." I opened the pouch. The Patek Philippe was there. The crystal was new, the casing was polished, it ticked rhythmically, a heartbeat restored. "Serena left me," he said quietly. "About a month ago. Said she couldn't live like a peasant. She found some tech guy in San Francisco. I didn't fight for her." He looked me in the eye. "I fought for this watch instead. Because when she dropped it, something broke in me, too. I realized I had become a man with no history, no spine. You were right, Mom. About everything." I looked at the watch, then at my son's battered hands. I saw the dirt under his fingernails. I saw the humility in his posture. "Sit down, Julian," I said softly. "I can't stay long," he said. "My shift starts at 2. I just wanted to return it. It belongs to you." "It belongs to the family," I corrected. "And you are family." I stood up and walked around the desk. I didn't hug him immediately. I took his hand, his rough, working man's hand in mine. "You fixed the watch," I said, "but you fixed something more important. You found your dignity." He broke down then. He wept, holding on to me, shaking with the release of months of shame and hardship. I held him tight, smelling the rain and the sawdust on his clothes, a smell that reminded me so much of my father that my heart ached. It has been 8 months since that Christmas. Julian did not move back into the mansion. He refused. He lives in a 1-bedroom apartment that he pays for himself. He is studying for his captain's license. He wants to work on the boats, not in the boardroom. He wants to earn his place. We have dinner every Sunday. I cook. He brings dessert. we talk about the tides, shipping routes, and the future. Serena is a footnote in our history, a painful lesson that cost millions of dollars but bought something priceless. Last night, as I sat by the fire, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the watch on the mantelpiece, I realized that the best gift I ever gave my son wasn't a trust fund, an education, or a car. It was the moment I took everything away. Because sometimes, you have to let the artificial lights go out so that you can finally see the stars. For anyone listening to this, remember, your self-worth is not defined by the brand of your clothes or the limit on your credit card. It is defined by what you refuse to tolerate. Never let anyone treat your dignity like cheap trash. If they do, show them the door. You might just find that the person you were waiting for was yourself all along.